All right. So, couple things before we get started. So, I've currently got posted your exam scores. It should show them to you in terms of what percent grade you got overall. I think they initially uploaded the number of correct. I kind of switched them over, so it'd be easier to kind of view, being able to see kind of that percent that you got. So, people have asked about how the bonus question, or I tried, to talk about for the. It's basically an extra question. If you got all 26 questions right, you got 26 out of 25. That would be 104%. If you missed one question throughout the exam, you'd still have 25 questions right out of 25. You could have gotten 100% still, right? So it just was points added to your grade if you got it right. Didn't count against your grade if you got it wrong, okay? So that's already factored into that grade that you see on Canvas. So some of you would see 104% actually. There's a handful of you that got every question right. The way I have the grade book is the quizzes are being counted just like the syllabus states, 15% of your grade, 4% from the module readings, 4% from the in-class participation quizzes, 8% from pack-back, and then the exam, which is now 21.5%. Okay. So your grade might have changed quite a bit because the exams are weighted pretty heavily in this class. Now, it also still kind of gives you a best case scenario in that the other two exams are another 20+%. So really, I could have went like worst case scenario if you didn't do well in the exam and make this weighted like for all three. Didn't do that, right? Kind of you haven't taken those exams yet. That wouldn't really be fair. But nothing else other than those categories are being counted towards the grade you see. In fact, anything down here in this assignments category is 0%. So that's like that review of module 1 reading, just so you could access it. This class participation that I had to update and kind of add points to it. So it was just kind of the raw scores. You can't see this. Don't worry about this. Your CL points aren't being factored into your grade right now. So I said those simply just get added in at the end of the semester. So people were asking about this as well. If you go to 6 CL sessions by end of the semester, each one's worth 0.25%. That's a total of 1.5%. If I had an 80% at the end of the semester, my final grade would be a 81.5%. It just gets added into your final grade at the end of the semester. I don't have it added in currently. I just have it up there to be kind of a placeholder to make sure you can see how many sessions you've attended. Okay. If you want or if you have questions about or want to review the exam, it's a good thing to kind of stop by office hours. I can kind of pull up your individual. Obviously, logistically, I can't sit here and hand back every single exam. So if you do want to review it, you can stop by in office hours and kind of take a look at it and review that. I should have some additional hours Friday. I might not post them until closer to Friday. But if you want to meet Friday and there's a time that works for you, let me know. I should be around most of the day. We can kind of schedule time for you to stop by. Otherwise, Wednesday's office hours, just stop by, first come, first serve. As usual, kind of the usual times. Other than that, overall, pretty good. You guys outperformed the first section. So I think the average across both sections was like a 76 or something, somewhere around there. I think you guys were like a 79, so right below a B. So usually I like to see kind of those averages, means be right around kind of that B- to C+ range. So that's kind of right where I wanted it. Now the exams will get a little bit, the material gets harder. I wouldn't say the exams necessarily get harder if you're continuing to keep up with the class. It's just that as we progress, some people stop showing up as much, right? Now, other things pop up throughout the semester. But as long as you kind of keep putting the same amount of effort in, should kind of have the same difficulty of exams on the next two, okay? So what I put up on Canvas, and this will be a little more useful as we get closer to the final, but because those exams are weighted heavier, what you can kind of do with this, so I have this hypothetical grade tool. It's under the Files tab on Canvas, just an Excel document. I've got like what a perfect score would be, just to kind of show you that the calculation is working correctly. So let's say I got hundreds on everything. Excuse me. And I went to every single CL session. I should get 103 in the class, right? Now, I can kind of start to change these. So there's this hypothetical person where they did the module readings and pack back, got the easy effort-based points, somebody got those turned in. In-class quizzes, they got most of the questions right when they show up to class, or maybe they missed one class. Weekly quizzes, they did right. and let's say they didn't do as well on that midterm. Well, if you can kind of do this thought experiment, like if I continue to do the same like level of quality on the next two, what would my final grade in the class be? Right? So you can kind of plug in some hypothetical values for the next two exams. Okay, what if I do a little bit better on the next two exams? Okay, I can get with a B minus. What if I really ace the next two? I can get up to an A. So you can kind of start to play around with these hypothetical exam two and final exam scores to kind of see what your grade would be at the class. You can get a slightly better idea of kind of where your grade is at. Currently on Canvas, those aren't factored in because we haven't taken place yet, right? And then I'll kind of revisit this when we get closer to the final. Once we have both of these exam scores in, the only thing that we really should need to play around with is kind of that hypothetical final exam score. Okay. Any other questions for me related to the exam before we kind of jump into material here? No? Like I said, overall, I mean, grades are pretty good. I think the overall grade in the class is relatively high. Like I said, with the midterm kind of average being like right below an 80, I forget what exactly it is, but it's something close to kind of a mid B range. So keep on putting effort in those areas where there's easy points. Because the exams, right, are going to be graded on how well you do, right? So pack back module readings, kind of try to get those easy effort-based points, kind of cushion your grade a little bit if you didn't do as well as you wanted to on the exams, okay? Or on the exam up to this point. All right, so just think if there's anything else I wanted to mention here. So we had what, that module reading 6 due last night. This week, we're going to kind of combine modules 5 and 6. So I don't want there to be any confusion. So I didn't even throw module 5's reading up there. I have it set so that you can see it on top hat. You can go and review it, but it wasn't for any points. The one that we kind of had assigned was this module 6 reading. Okay. So we'll start out, we'll cover all the stuff in module 5 easily today and dive into kind of first part of module 6. A little bit different than some of the other classes do it, but module 5, there's not a whole lot of information there. Okay. So unless there's any other questions for me, we'll kind of get started here today. No questions? Ready to exam? Mention CL sessions. Okay. All right. So, what else do I want to say? All right. So you'll kind of start to see today, this class is cumulative. So I'm not going to go in the next exam ask you module 2 type question, but we're building on the principles and the things that the topics that we're talking about. So first thing I have up here is allocated efficiency. We've used this term before, right? So we said the allocated efficient point, even back in the PPC models, was where what? The marginal cost is equal to the marginal benefit, right? For us in markets, what did that look like? Well, what represented our marginal benefits and our marginal costs? Our supply and our demand curve. So when a market was in equilibrium, when supply was equal to demand, what did we really say that represents? That is where the marginal benefit of the last unit is equal to the marginal cost. That is the allocated efficient point for that market. Okay? So one thing that we'll talk about, and we'll have a little bit better idea as we kind of work through some stuff here in a second, but when we're at this allocated efficient point, it's called the allocated efficient. We're allocating our resources efficiently because it's where we've maximized, we kind of think about it as like the total net benefit for society. Now, this net benefit, we'll start kind of using a different term, which is economic surplus. So it's not like surplus shortages in the number of units. Economic surplus is just the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs, right? So it's kind of like the net benefit is another way of thinking about what economic surplus is. And let me get this out of here. All right, so that was our equilibrium point. So if we think about consumer surplus, I'm going to actually kind of go ahead and draw this out and build this for us. And I think we can go to the slides a little bit quicker. And I think it'll maybe help hopefully make a little more sense. So yes. Let's say we're looking at a market. First of all, what's my upward sloping curve? Supply. What's the downward sloping curve? demand. What would this point represent? Where supply is equal to demand, starts with an E, my equilibrium, right? So here's my equilibrium. Supply represents the marginal cost to producers. Demand represented our marginal benefits to consumers. Okay? So if this market is in equilibrium, we're going to start to think about something that we call consumer surplus. Okay? So the consumer surplus that exists from any one unit, when you go and buy something, what is the total net benefit to you? It's going to be the difference between your marginal benefits and your marginal costs as a consumer. When I buy something, what represents my marginal benefits? I have it drawn up here. Marginal benefit is represented by the demand curve, right? What is the marginal cost to a consumer? When you buy something, the cost to you is the equilibrium price, right? Whatever price you have to pay. Now, that's going to be true for every unit you buy. So if we're writing this mathematically, consumer surplus, for the very first unit, we can kind of think about it visually. It's the difference between that marginal benefit, the point I'm at in the demand curve, right? How do we find that? Right? We plug in the different quantities into the demand. We could figure out the marginal benefit. That was part of what we did in module 3. So I'm going to do that for every single unit that's purchased up to that equilibrium quantity. Right? So mathematically, I'm going to add up starting with the first unit and then kind of, well, I won't write too much, but we'll go going all the way to the last. Don't worry, I'm not going to like use this notation a lot, but really all this is saying is for every unit to get total consumer surplus, I'm adding up the difference between the demand curve or the consumer's marginal benefits and their marginal cost or the price of the good at every unit. So you can think about it as the consumer surplus would be this shaded area here, the area under the demand curve, but above our equilibrium price. Okay. Any questions on this idea? So you can think of it, it's like the total net benefit to the consumer every time they buy something is the difference between their marginal benefits of buying it, consuming it, and the marginal costs. Their marginal benefits are represented by the demand curve. Their marginal costs are the price they have to pay for this product. Okay. Any questions on that idea? So you're going to want to stop. We're going to build on, everything's going to build this week. So we've got to make sure we get questions early if we have them. Okay. So I said, you can kind of think about it as like economic surplus, or consumer surplus is like the consumer's net benefits. Okay. What would producer surplus be? Once again, it's going to be the difference between, it's the net benefits to producers. So what's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers? Well, what's the marginal benefit to the producer? If I sell something, the benefit is the price I can sell it for, right? So my equilibrium price is going to be the producer's marginal benefits. What represents their marginal costs? The supply curve. So once again, that would be the net benefit to producers that exists for every unit I produce. Well, we're interested in adding that up across every single unit, starting with the first, going all the way to that equilibrium quantity. So visually, what's that going to be? The area below, right, the area between the price and the supply curve. Here, this would represent my producer surplus. Okay. So a non-technical way of remembering this, I would try to kind of get down this intuition. Right? All economic surplus is whoever you're interested in finding the surplus of, it's the difference between their marginal benefits and their marginal costs. But a non-technical way of remembering markets, where is consumer surplus? It's always going to be the triangle on top. Producer surplus is always going to be the triangle on the bottom. Now, what if I was interested in the total surplus of this market? What do you think I would do? So I don't care if the surplus is coming from economic surplus is coming from producers or consumers. I'm just interested in the total. So what would I do? Just add the two together, right? I would take producer and consumer surplus, add them together, which would really just give me the difference between what? The marginal benefits and the marginal costs to the entire market. I don't care if it's producers or consumers anymore. So here, what represents my marginal benefit? The demand curve. What represents the marginal cost of supply? So total surplus is just that total area in between our supply and demand curve, or the sum of producer and consumer surplus. Any questions on anything there before we keep moving? Okay with this? All right. So, slightly different way of thinking about this, right? So, I have a little bit more of like the summation sign written out here. I would not worry too much about this formula or this equation. I would think about consumer surplus as always the difference between the demand curve and what the equilibrium price is, or the consumer's marginal benefits and their marginal costs is really what that's saying. So my consumer surplus, always the triangle on top, or I should say the area on top. Once we start imposing some government restrictions, this gets a little bit different, right? So if I wanted to calculate consumer surplus, notice what's the shape? How do I find the area of a triangle? 1/2 times base times height, right? So what's the height of this triangle? Goes from 100 to 40, so 60. Base goes from 0 to 50, so 50. So 50 times 60 is 3,000 times 1/2 would give me that consumer surplus of 1,500. Right? So we're just finding the area of triangles here, right? Before we talk about any government kind of restrictions. We're just looking at a market, nice free market. The government hasn't gotten involved. Our consumer surplus, at least for this class, nice linear demand curves, just finding the area of a triangle. Right? Now, if I had like some curvature, we have to do some like integration. It's not, kind of past this class. We won't do that. We'll just keep everything linear, right? So the area of a triangle. Okay. Any questions on this idea? So just to kind of get at this idea, what's happening to the consumer surplus as the price goes down here? So if the price is lower, demand curve doesn't change, what's going to happen to consumer surplus? Yeah, price for consumers is a bad thing. So if I'm lowering the bad thing, their net benefit should be higher, right? And visually, if I lower that price, it'd just be a larger and larger triangle, right? Now, what if I have producer surplus? Well, that's just the difference between, we kind of already talked about this, the equilibrium price and their marginal cost of their supply curve. The net benefits to the producers. Less technical, triangle on the bottom, right? Area on the bottom. So if I had some numbers put to this, right? How would I find producer surplus? It's just that difference between the equilibrium price and the supply curve. Once again, what is this the shape of? Triangle, right? Point in the opposite direction. So what? 40 times 50 times, that's right. No, 50 times 50 times 1/2, about 1250, right? So I can calculate the area of these triangles. Shouldn't be anything crazy, I don't think. So these two markets were a little bit different. But if I wanted total surplus here, let's assume for a second we had the same equilibrium price in both these markets. So before I had a consumer surplus of, was it 1,500? If I have, sorry, a consumer surplus of 1,500, if I have producer surplus of 1,250, what would my total surplus be? Simply add those two together, or what? 2,750. What happens if the equilibrium price goes up? What would happen to producer surplus here? Is the price a good or a bad thing if I'm the producer, if I'm selling something? It's good. So what's going to happen at producer net benefit or producer economic surplus? It's going to go up. Okay? So you can kind of think about that as if that price was continue to rise, what's happening in the area of my triangle? I've got a larger and larger triangle. Okay. So nothing too crazy, I don't think there. You can kind of think about this as the idea of like, what is economic surplus? It's the difference between how much I would have been willing to pay and how much I actually paid. So if I was willing to pay up to $4,000, but I only had to pay $3,000, my kind of economic surplus is $1,000 there. I would have been willing to pay that much more. So it's how much I've kind of like kept in my pocket, so to speak. Producer surplus, the exact opposite. It's how much would I have supplied this to the market for, and how much was I able to get, right? So maybe I would have done something for $1,000, for sure, then I'll do it for $3,000. So I would have been willing to accept a much lower amount, but my producer surplus would have been like $2,000. Right? I could have been that much worse off because I would have been willing to do it for a much, much lower price. And that's going to exist if we think about these markets here. I mean, once we have this equilibrium price, at every unit, the marginal benefit is above the price, right? So I would have been willing to pay a higher price as the consumer than what I ended up paying. And every producer would have been willing to accept a lower price than what they end up being able to sell it for. And kind of go up to that equilibrium point. That would be true for every single unit there. Okay. Just to point something out here, as long as I have this graph pulled up. Why would I never see the quantity be out here? Well, we know this is the allocated efficient point, but what would end up being true? Let's say I had this equilibrium price. For producers, what would be true about every unit here? The marginal cost would be above the price they can sell it for. So what would be happening to their net benefit or their economic surplus? From every unit here, it would be this area, but this area would be negative. I'd used to be hurting my net benefits would just be going down. For every unit here, for consumers, how much would they be benefiting? How much is it costing them? Once again, we could find the area of this triangle, but what does it represent? Negative surplus to consumers. So why would producers or consumers ever want to go past that quantity? They wouldn't, right? That's why we identified it as the equilibrium. That's why it is the allocated efficient point. All right. Any questions on this? I might stay here. Let me see what I've got. Yeah. I've got a slide. Well, we'll bounce back to set this up here. So what we're going to talk about today is probably just have time for price ceilings and a little bit of discussion on price floors. But that basically, in a nutshell, is module 5 we just went through. That's why I kind of combined the two. There's not a whole lot of meat on the bones, right? So we're thinking about these surplus to both producers and consumers. We're now going to introduce a third party. This third party is the government, right? So the government can come in, they can do a bunch of things and screw with markets, right? So they can impose price ceilings, price floors, quotas, taxes, subsidies. We'll kind of talk about all of them. We may not quite have time to talk about subsidies. We'll see kind of how Thursday's class goes. But we want to understand how all of these government interactions can then influence producer, consumer surplus, and then total surplus in the market. So when we have the government come in, but without them, we were at the allocated efficient point. We said that is where total surplus is what? At its maximum, right? So at that allocated efficient point, that was where total surplus was maximized. If I move away from that point, what's going to happen to total surplus? Well, if it was already maximized, what's the only possibility? It goes lower, right? So when the government comes in and gets involved, what's happening to total surplus? It has to be going down. That loss of surplus, we're going to call deadweight loss. Right? All deadweight loss means is a fancy term for the loss of surplus because of the government's actions. Okay. Questions on this before we keep moving? It's kind of just a setup slide for what we're going to talk about. We'll go dive into each one of these a little bit deeper. So just to kind of give you some context, and then I'll kind of build this out for us here. So we've got price ceilings is the first one that we're going to work through. So sometimes the government might see a market and they think the price of something is too high. So I think I got an example in the slides of rental prices. Like let's say that the average price of a one-bedroom apartment in Bloomington was like $4,000 a month. They're like, yeah, students can't afford to live here. We need to come in and lower that price, right? Maybe they look at the market for eggs right now. And they're like, yeah, people can't afford to, have this staple product of their diet. We need to lower the price artificially. That might sound good, right? We'll talk about why it's not necessarily good, okay? So another thing we see anytime during like war, anything that usually they want to like product you would want to use for war, you lower the price because you make it cheaper so the military can buy more of this to kind of, I don't know, build tanks, planes, all the other things they need, right? So we've got examples of this. And what impacts are these price ceilings going to have in our market? Okay. So there we go. Let's say I've got this market and it's currently in equilibrium. So we'll say, whoops. So right here, okay. Once the government comes in and sets a price ceiling, the only way it's effective, so let's come up with a hypothetical price. Let's say this price is 50. So what does a ceiling do? It doesn't prevent you from going any higher. So what's the only way we have an effective price ceiling? Well, if I say, look, you can't charge a price any higher than $100. Let's say I set my price ceiling up here. What do the people in this market tell me? Am I charging a price of $100 or more? No. So what's going to happen? It's a useless law. You just wasted a bunch of time as the government, right? Congrats, right? What would be an effective price ceiling? So not something set above the equilibrium price. It would have to be set somewhere below, right? So in order to be an effective, if I can spell, price ceiling, it's going to have to be something set below that equilibrium price. Okay? Now, what are the implications of this effective price ceiling going to be? Okay? So I probably shouldn't have drawn these out in the same one. I'm just going to clean this graph up a little bit so we can think about what do these price ceilings do. So before the price ceiling, where would my consumer and producer surplus have been? So remember, demand is marginal benefit, supply represents our marginal cost. So before, consumer surplus, equilibrium price would have been right here, right? So consumer surplus would have been this area. Producer surplus would have been down here. So you can kind of see this black shaded area would have represented kind of total surplus to us, right? And kind of half of it being producer and half of it being consumers. Once I impose this price ceiling, so the old quantity in the market was out here. What's going to be true about the new equilibrium quantity? Well, I can no longer charge that higher price, right? The price ceiling, you can almost think about it if it helps. These prices are no longer possible, right? So what happens? Well, past this quantity, what's true about the marginal cost to the producers relative to the price they can charge? Those marginal costs are what relative to that new price? Above. So if I'm producing something, what is the price to me? The marginal benefit, that is now less than my marginal cost. Do I want to supply any of these to the market? No. It's going to cost me more than I'm benefiting. So after this price ceiling, the equilibrium quantity we see in the market essentially is going to be pushed down. We wouldn't call it equilibrium quantity because it involves a government action to kind of get us there. But we're going to see the market arrive at a lower quantity. Okay. So every single unit here, right, we're no longer going to see these produced in the market. So can they be consumed? No, right? If no one produces them, no one can consume them. So what would all of this represent? This would all be surplus that we lost out on or dead weight loss. So here's our dead weight loss, kind of this triangle that I guess like points to the right. It's not a technical way of remembering it, right? But it's essentially the total surplus lost from all those units that we're no longer seeing out there in the market. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Yeah. So if I had like a grid line to this, how would I find deadweight loss? It's the area of a triangle, 1/2 times base times height. Yep. Okay. Now, slightly, maybe a little bit more difficult, and I could use colors and do it on the same graph. I'll kind of just pull this apart to make it, I think, a little bit easier. So let's say I had the same setup. I impose this price ceiling. It's effective. The new quantity is down here. All right. Let me keep an eye on time here. Oh, we're good. Where is my new? So before, what would consumer surplus have been without a price ceiling? It was this whole triangle, right? We said it was this upper triangle. What is consumer surplus going to be now after this price ceiling? So consumer surplus is going to be the difference between what? The marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. What's the marginal benefit to consumers? Represented by our demand curve. What's the marginal cost? It's the new price with the price ceiling. So where would consumer surplus be? The area below demand, but above the price. We'll notice now it's kind of like the area of this triangle plus the area of this rectangle. Okay. So before, it was kind of like this triangle here. And I'll have a different representation in the slides. I think they'll do a slightly better job of this. But notice, this used to be consumer surplus and no longer is. But there was this huge gain in consumer surplus as well. Now, intuitively, if I lower the price, who is that going to help the most? Or who does it have the potential to help? Consumers. Lower prices are good for consumers. Who is it definitely going to hurt? Producers. So I'll talk about why it might not help consumers here in a second. But in general, if you're looking at it, you're like, oh, yeah, consumers lost a little triangle, they gained a big rectangle, they're probably better off. So let me label this. Where would producer surplus be? Well, producer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. Their marginal benefit is the price. Marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So this would represent our new producer surplus. What was producer surplus before this price ceiling? It was like this entire triangle or this entire area here. So producer surplus, when we lower the price, what's going to happen? It's going to go down. And I'll walk through, I guess I've got another visual in the slides here in a second. Now, we know producer surplus for sure has to decrease. It looks like consumer surplus could increase. However, it could decrease as well. And often when understanding these, sometimes using the most extreme case is helpful to think about. So I mentioned that, okay, as I have this price ceiling where I'm lowering the price, I'm losing a little bit of consumer surplus in that triangle, but I'm gaining like that rectangle. What happens if I lower the price all the way to 0? What happens to the equilibrium quantity in the market? I can't charge anything for a product, how many am I going to supply? 0. So how many can be consumed? So what is consumer surplus? So if I lower the price enough, consumer surplus eventually has to start decreasing, right? Kind of the size of that little triangle relative to the rectangle, that ratio would kind of start to flip, right? I think it's helpful to think about the most extreme cases. If I set like a price at 0, oh, well, then I would drive consumer surplus to 0 because the market just wouldn't exist. But because I'm lowering the prices, it has the potential to help consumer surplus, right? There's no potential to help producers here. Lowering the price, I'm just going to be hurting them. Okay? And then also, any type of price ceiling is going to do what to my total surplus? It's going to move me away from the allocated efficient point or where total surplus is maximized. So if I'm moving away from that point, I know that I'm going to have a loss of surplus, which is deadweight loss, right? So any movement kind of away from that equilibrium point is going to create some deadweight loss. Any other questions on this before I keep moving? Yeah. So what happens to total surplus? If we're at the equilibrium point, we said total surplus is. So if I move away from that point, what has to be happening to total surplus? It's going down. That loss of total surplus is what we would call. So all of this surplus that was lost, we call that deadweight loss, right? So any effective price ceiling is going to create deadweight loss, essentially. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So we've got, okay. So just another way of looking at this, I think could be helpful. So let's say I had rent control. And here's the current equilibrium price and quantity, just where supply is equal to demand. Okay. So what is my consumer and producer surplus? Consumer surplus, area below the demand curve, but above the price. Producer surplus, area below my price, but above the supply. So total surplus would be the sum of those two. It's maximized, everything's good. You know, $1,000 a month, I think is too high for my little town. I then impose a price ceiling, and I say, look, you can't charge more than $800 a month for an apartment. Right? What's going to happen? Well, just intuitively, if I lower the price, do you think there's going to be people are going to want to supply more or less than before? Less, right? So I move to a lower point on my supply curve, right? Any quantity past 1.8 million now, the marginal cost of providing those apartments is above. Remember, what is the price? It's the marginal benefit to the supplier. So the marginal benefit to the supplier or producer is now lower. It doesn't make sense for me to supply those markets. So maybe he's like, well, that's weird with these apartments. Well, no, maybe it was like space that it used to make sense to convert it. Like maybe it was like dividing up an apartment into two, a building into 2 apartments, but it doesn't make sense anymore because I can't charge as much money for it. So there's a personal example, but my elementary school as a kid, they're selling it. And that's what they're trying to figure out right now is what the market price is if they can turn it into apartments. And essentially, the marginal cost of turning it into apartments is going to be above that marginal benefit or the price they can charge, right? So it's the same idea here. It's just that we're artificially not allowing these companies, these firms, these producers to charge a price above 800. So what impact does that have on our equilibrium? Well, now no quantity past 1.8. The marginal cost is now above the marginal benefit. Here's our new equilibrium quantity in the market. Where would producer surplus be? Well, it's going to be the area below the new price that's being set of 800 and above the supply curve. Where would consumer surplus be? Area below the demand curve, but above this new price. Now, notice, here's my new consumer surplus. Oops, sorry. We'll do producer surplus first, then we'll do consumers. Producer surplus used to be really large. Now it's a much smaller area. What was lost? This little triangle and this rectangle. So what does this little triangle represent? Well, this is going to end up being part of deadweight loss that comes from producers. Now, this rectangle, when I'm calculating consumer surplus, it represents the part of new consumer surplus that used to be producer surplus that's been like transferred to consumers. So you can think about like politically, price ceilings are attractive close to an election, because what am I doing here? I'm taking net benefits from companies and I'm giving them to voting public. To most of us, the consumers, right? So I've transferred some of this economic surplus to the voters or the consumers, right? And they've seen actually likely an increase in consumer surplus, but not necessarily, because it would have to be that this transfer is greater than, well, what did the consumers lose out on? Well, they lost out on this little amount of surplus here as well. Okay. So we've got some loss that just is gone, right? This deadweight loss. These apartments are no longer supplied, so they can't be consumed in the market. That surplus is gone. Part of what used to be producer surplus is now consumer surplus. So producers have been hurt. Consumers potentially have benefited, right? But what consumers benefit here? So if I am still renting an apartment, I'm now paying a lower price, right? So my net benefit, I am keep my apartment is good, right? It's gone up, and my price I'm paying is lower. What about the people in between 1.8 and 2 million? What are they now doing? Walking around trying to find a place to live, right? Those units are no longer out there. So what can I essentially help somewhat cause with price ceilings that sound like a good idea? I'm lowering rental prices for people. I'm doing good. I'm the government. I know everything. Well, what did I just do to these people? Took away their house. I don't even where to live now, right? So, it sounds like a great idea when we impose these, price ceilings, right? Like the best way to cause homelessness, right? Like, I mean, when we start getting involved in these markets, we're artificially going to be causing things to be out of this equilibrium, or this point where total surplus is maximized for society. Okay. Also, I wanted to reiterate here, and I'll do a drawing, or I'll draw it out real quick. When we have these effective price, also, I think I'm supposed to say unhoused or something now, but you get what I'm getting at, right? The government sucks is basically the end of the story. So let's say I do have this effective price ceiling. What is my new quantity supply going to be? Well, where am I at in my supply curve? Down here. Where's my new quantity demanded? Okay. So we can talk about economic surplus, but if I'm talking about shortages or surplus in the number of units, what have I created by artificially lowering that price by imposing a price ceiling? The quantity demanded is now greater than quantity supplied, so I've got a what? I've got a shortage, and here, just to kind of make it clear, because when we talk about some other things, we'll talk about surplus in the number of units. We've got a shortage in the number of units now. I've kind of created this shortage by artificially lowering the price. Yeah. Excuse me. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? So I think I tried to look up my phrase for today was price ceilings, right? The best way to make affordable housing non-existent housing, right? Like you can completely eliminate these markets and you lower the price enough. Yeah.
So in that case, like, wouldn't the market of the type of good be the determinant of whether the price ceiling be efficient or not? Because if you're, let's say, putting a price ceiling on, let's say, drugs, so wouldn't in that case it be efficient?
I'm putting a price ceiling on trucks.
Yeah.
So what would happen if I put a price ceiling on trucks?
Drugs.
Drugs.
Yeah, so in that case.
Oh, I got you. Well, I mean, depends who you ask. What if I put a price ceiling on drugs? What's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity of drugs used? gonna go down. So maybe you think that's a good thing for society. But what's gonna happen to everybody who was using drugs before in this range? They no longer can find drugs to buy. I mean, we generally think of drug use isn't a good thing, but it provides them with marginal benefit.
No, but wouldn't that be a better thing?
Once again, you're making a judgment call. I mean, I can say that drug use is a bad thing, but it's not a bad thing to the person using the drug. They enjoy it. So let's say, I'll give you another example, because drugs are drugs. But let's say we don't think that you should go skydiving, because it's dangerous and some people die. Actually, no, let's say airplanes, right? Because some people die, right? Because they're all doing everything now, right? So I propose a price ceiling, and I definitely can limit the amount of this product that's going to be consumed. But what happens to people who enjoyed skydiving? They just lost a bunch of surplus. So we could have a longer discussion of like, should we value all surplus the same, right? Well, when you make individual decisions, you really do, right? Like you do what provides you the highest amount of like benefit. Now that benefit's hard to measure, and also not completely be dismissive. Your point is also well taken, because we haven't talked about externalities yet. It can make sense to impose these price ceilings if the use of something hurts other people outside of them. So if we're just talking about the benefits and costs that exist in the market, then no, price ceilings would never increase surplus. However, if we factor in the fact that the market for drugs imposes additional cost on people that aren't even involved in the market for drugs, then yes, then the limiting the quantity could be better off for society. But we haven't talked about externalities yet, so we haven't left that into the equation. If we're purely thinking about from a market standpoint, just the people involved in this market, there's no government intervention that would actually lead to a higher level of total surplus. Is that what you're kind of getting at? But you're seeing where we're going, because the next module we talk about externalities, the combination of externalities and some of these price controls, we can't actually get to a point that's better for society. So yeah. Yep. All right. And I'm not endorsing drugs. I feel like I should not be recording this. All right. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Yeah. I mean, if it's already illegal, technically, what's the price ceiling? You're not supposed to be able to sell it. The price ceiling is 0. You can't sell it. So it's not. We're talking about legal products here. You would cause a black market by imposing a price ceiling, because you can kind of think about it this way: all the people who would have been buying this good before, they're willing to pay a higher price. Now, nobody legally can sell them this product at this lower price, no one legally can sell them this product at the higher price. So what happens? Well, if 0.2 million people just lost their apartment, they might not be able to legally go find an apartment at this kind of legal, the $800 price. So what might they do? You might see a black market pop up. People might be doing things kind of like not on the books, right? In fact, we got time. You can do this. Speaking of drugs, you can do the same thing, thinking about like legal versus illegal drug markets, right? If I artificially lower prices by so I think they were subsidizing. If I subsidize some of the marijuana industries once they legalized it in states like Michigan, Illinois, essentially, subsidize it. They heavily tax them, similar to price ceilings. You can cause changes in the price, and then what happens? You see black markets pop up. Because if you want to go buy it legally, the price is going to be much, much higher. And so what happens? People find ways to buy it kind of under the table, not legally. Same idea here. If I artificially lower the price, if I don't have a home, I'm going to go out and try to find someone who's going to rent to me at not illegal prices, right? Which is why in like really large cities that impose rent controls, you end up with these like wild photos of like somebody turned the you know, like Harry Potter style, turn the under the stairs into like a one studio bedroom apartment or something crazy, right? Where they kind of break all these laws and they're still charging these prices that don't line up with the price ceiling. So we will see black markets pop up when we do have these artificial price ceilings kind of imposed. Is that what you were saying at? Any other questions for Keith? I get excited about this stuff. I apologize. It's early, right? Jeez. Okay, so we've got 25 minutes. So we have plenty of time. I'll go through this real quick before I jump the gun. So we've already talked about like all this. Really, this is kind of like a summary slide. So we said it causes shortages in number of units, waste resources, won't go through a lot on that. We just talked about it can cause black markets. I'll probably mention this a little bit more when we talk about taxes on Thursday. So lower, it has to lower the price. In order to be effective, we said it has to be set below that equilibrium price. And if it's ineffective, it'll be set above that equilibrium price, and it's just not going to change anything. Okay. So what's another way of looking at this? So if I had a market equilibrium, what would the area of consumer surplus be? What shapes? A plus B plus E, right? If there's no price ceiling, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve, but above price. So A, B, and E. Right? Oops. What would producer surplus be? Area below price, above the supply curve. So C, D, and F. Okay. After we have this price ceiling, what's kind of our new equilibrium quantity going to be? Well, at this lower price, the quantity supplied is going to be lower. They're not going to want to supply as much. Quantity demand is going to be higher. So I've created a shortage. Now, it doesn't matter how much people want to buy. This is the number of units supplied to the market. That will be our new equilibrium quantity. Okay. So at this new equilibrium quantity, excuse me, what, excuse me, is this new price? Well, here's our price ceiling. So what is consumer surplus going to be? Well, the difference between that price they pay and the demand curve. So it'll now be A, B, and C. So notice consumers lost this area of E, right? But they gained this much larger area of C. So it's likely that consumers will be better off. We talked about kind of the size of E, that triangle E to C, the rectangle C. That's going to change as we lower the price more and more. Okay, so consumers could be better off. They could have been hurt. We said, how can I think about that? Well, if I lower the price low enough to zero, the market goes away. All right. What about producers? Well, before, producers had C, D, and F. After that price ceiling, they're now only going to have this lower triangle, this area of D. So producer surplus is definitely going to decrease, right? And then what would this area of E and F represent? Well, this was deadweight loss. E was the kind of total surplus loss from consumers. F was the total surplus we lost out from producers. Okay. So just different ways of kind of looking at the same thing here. Here I've got some values. We'll come back to this if we have time. I think it's going to be more beneficial for you guys. We've got all the pieces, kind of try to work on this with the people around you, okay? So got this quiz published on the main homepage now. Scroll really fast. So the last two questions we haven't talked about. So we'll work through those two together. But the first two, I want you to talk to the people around you. Think about what we talked about. Identify consumer, producer, total surplus, deadweight loss. Work on those first two questions. I'll probably give you 7 or 8 minutes. If you want to take a look at the last two questions, we haven't talked about price floors yet. You can probably start to think about what they're going to look like. And then we'll work through question 3 and 4 together. And then that should give you plenty of time to get that submitted before we get out of class here today. Okay. So talk to the people around you, work on those first two together. I won't go through those with you. And then after 7 or 8 minutes, we'll go through questions 3 and 4 together. Okay. Again, you don't have to be quiet. Person next to you might understand something you don't. Vice versa. All right, so I said we're gonna work through 3 and 4 together, so I'd hold off on submitting it until we kind of go through those. In fact, I feel like being nice. So as long as I get some, as long as I see you guys are working on things, I'm generally pretty helpful. So this first one, work through all 4 of them together. I'm in a good mood. So I'm always in a good. So, all right, so we've got a price ceiling of $30 in this market. What would the equilibrium price be without a price ceiling? Where does supply equal demand? 50. So what do I need in order to have an effective price ceiling? The price has to be set below the equilibrium, right? Prevent it from getting up to that equilibrium price. So if I want to know what consumer surplus is after this price ceiling, consumer surplus is the difference between what? The marginal benefit and the marginal cost to consumers. What's the marginal benefit to consumers? No, that I didn't know this, because I looked at these answers. The marginal benefits to consumers is my demand curve. So it's the area underneath my demand curve, but above, what's the marginal cost to consumers? Price. What's my new price? 30, right? So my consumer surplus would be this entire area right here. Only up to the new equilibrium quantity though, right? Not up to the old equilibrium, because now at this lower price, what's the last unit that the suppliers are going to want to supply to the market? Like a quantity of 20, right? Anything past 20, that marginal cost for my supply curve is now going to be above the price, which for the producers, that price was there, marginal benefit. So we're going to stop at that quantity of 20. So I've got what? Area of this rectangle is 40 times 20, so 800. The area of this triangle is 20 times 20 times a half, so 200. So 800 plus 200 should be 1,000. Okay, so that should be my consumer surplus after this price ceiling. Now I didn't ask the question here, but what would my producer surplus be? This would be the area below. What are the marginal benefits to producers? Price. So the area below the new price of 30, but above their marginal cost, which are represented by the supply curve. So this little triangle down here. So what? 20 times 20 times a half. Producer surplus there would be 200. What would my deadweight loss be? Well, what would the total surplus be? I could do it 2 ways, really. So first of all, what would total surplus be after this price ceiling? We just said consumer surplus was 1,000. What was producer surplus? So total surplus is 1,200. We just add those 2 together. So instead of thinking about where deadweight loss is, what does deadweight loss represent? It's the loss of total surplus after the price ceiling. So what would total surplus be before the price ceiling? Yeah, this entire triangle, the entire area in between supply and demand. So that'd be what? 80 times 40 times a half. So 1,600, if I'm doing math in my head. Did I look at these right? 80 times, yeah, 1,600. So it was 1,600. We said it now is 1,200. So what was the loss of surplus? That's 400. That's my deadweight loss. Now visually, where does that deadweight loss come from? Comes from the fact that we're no longer seeing any of these units in between 20 and 40 in our market anymore. So this area here would represent deadweight loss. Hopefully when I find the area of this, it's going to be 400. Sure enough, 40 times 20, right, times a half should kind of give me that 400 deadweight loss value as well. So really kind of two ways I actually technically could compute that. Find what total surplus is before, find what it is after. The difference between the two should just be the same as if you just calculated that deadweight loss triangle there. Kind of talk through a lot of that quick. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. We're good with that? Okay. We're going to keep using this stuff next class for sure. So on 2, if I do have a price ceiling, we kind of already went through this, but what does a price ceiling do? Compared to the equilibrium price, it lowers the price. What's going to happen to produce a surplus for sure? Decreases, right? Price is a good thing for producers. They're definitely going to be hurt. Right? Quantity goes down and price goes down. Good. You have to sell things. That's the case. What's going to happen to deadweight loss? Yes, as we lower that kind of price, or we kind of lower that price ceiling. Yeah, in fact, it's easy to remember it's going to increase because let's say I like just barely. Let's say I like just barely imposed a price ceiling and showed it to you. Okay, so my new quantity is like barely below the old equilibrium. What would my deadweight loss be? I can't even visually really show. It'd be a very small amount, right? Now, what happens is I start to lower that pricing. This is where use the extremes to your advantage. If I impose a price ceiling all the way down here, what did we say? What's deadweight loss? Is anyone going to supply that first unit to the market? Nope. I've lowered the price way too much. So deadweight loss would be the entire market. So as I lower that price, what's happening to deadweight loss? It goes from being really small to really large. So my deadweight loss is going up as I lower that price ceiling lower and lower and lower. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So I want to set us up for next class with the last 2 questions. And maybe you could kind of already guess where I was going with this. But let's say instead of a price ceiling, I'll do number 4 first because it's easy. So let's say we had the equilibrium price here. And I think I had it to be 50. Let's say we impose, instead of a price ceiling of 30, let's say I impose a price floor of $30. So if a price ceiling means I can't charge a price any higher than 30, a price floor means I can't charge a price any lower, right? So if I tell you you can't charge a price lower than 30 and you're currently charging 50, what happens? Nothing, right? I'm not. Leave me alone, right? So in order for us to have an effective price floor, where would it have to be? Somewhere above this, right? Here's another way of remembering like effective price floors and ceilings. If you draw in your price floor, think about like it's a floor, so it has to be that the area below it, your equilibrium price is in that range. Just like when you have an effective price ceiling, the area above it is what you're canceling out. The equilibrium price has to be in that range. Okay? So think about like a ceiling. If you want to like cross this area out, it's no longer possible. If the old equilibrium price is in that area, it's going to be an effective price floor. If I set an effective price ceiling. If I have a price floor and I set it up here, well, what prices am I no longer allowing? Anything down here? Well, that was my old equilibrium price, so it's going to be effective. That's one way of kind of, I don't know, another way of thinking or visually of effective price floors and price ceilings. But if we, instead of having an ineffective price floor, had one that was effective, so we just said, if I have my equilibrium price and quantity, let's say the price started out at 50, an effective price floor would have to be something what relative to 50? So if it's lower, is that going to be effective? No. If I tell you you can't charge a price lower than 30, I'm not. So we said, in order to be an effective price floor, it's got to be above the equilibrium, the exact opposite of a price ceiling. Okay. So all these concepts we talked about, the price ceilings, it's going to be very similar to price floors, but everything's going to kind of be flipped, right? So think about why. Well, I think the question asked for the easiest part of this is, if this is the new price, what's going to be true about every quantity past this point? The marginal benefits. So this is going to end up being, I'll jump the gun, our kind of quantity after the price floor. If this is the lowest possible price that someone can charge, the marginal benefit for all these units is now what relative to the price? Less than. So for consumers, would it make sense to buy these? The additional benefits lower than the additional costs, so no. So now with price ceilings, it was producers who stopped supplying things to the market. With price floors, it's consumers who stop buying things, right? So what would total surplus have been before this entire triangle? Afterwards, we no longer see any of these units. So where is deadweight loss? Deadweight loss is always going to be the area in between supply and demand of the units that are no longer being produced or sold in that market. So for us, what are the units no longer being produced or sold in this market? That area in between supply and demand, right? All of this is what was lost. Okay. I think if we're looking at the graph, we'll jump back and grab the number here in a second. But just to kind of make the point, what's happening to consumer surplus? Well, intuitively, if the price is now higher, what should be true? If I'm thinking about consumer surplus, that's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. Their marginal benefit is the demand curve. Their marginal cost is the price. So if you increase the price, what's going to happen to consumer surplus? It's going to go, well, if I'm subtracting the price here, if the price goes up intuitively, if you're paying more for something, are you going to be better or worse off than before? If you're the consumer. Worse. What's happening to consumer surplus when prices go up? Subtracting a larger value. So what has to be happening to consumer surplus? It's really small, right? Consumer surplus was the difference between the price floor and the demand curve. You know, without the price floor, it was the difference between the demand curve and the equilibrium price. So with price floors, we're raising the price. We're going to hurt consumers. What's going to happen to producers? Well, producer surplus, difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. What's the marginal benefit to the producer? The price. What's the marginal costs? Their supply curve, right? So if I'm raising the price, what does that have the potential to do to producer surplus? For them, as I raise the price, it could be that it increases producer surplus. Where would producer surplus be now? The area below price, but above the supply curve. So we're losing this triangle from producer surplus, but we're gaining this rectangle. It's just like with price ceilings, but everything's in reverse, right? Now, I said here, just to be clear, it has the potential to increase producer surplus. If I have a price floor that's too high, eventually what happens to the equilibrium quantity? Goes to zero, which means everything goes to zero, so everyone's hurt, right? But if I have a moderate price floor, it has the potential to help producers. So on question 3, when we're asked about what the value of deadweight loss is, it's what surplus was lost out on from no longer having this equilibrium quantity of 40, but instead only having this equilibrium quantity of 20. So it looks like that triangle is what? 40 times 20 times a half, so 400. And then we said, what happened if I had an ineffective price floor? Nothing changes, right? Everything's going to remain the same. So should have the answers to all 4 questions. It should be easy points as long as you're showing up to class. I can't reiterate this enough. I also have a loose idea. I ran some of those regressions. Oh, did I show that? I didn't show that, you guys. Just on the way out, because I think it's interesting. I have all the data from the exams and I actually ran what's called a regression, from stats background. It basically tells me the relationship between attendance at the CL sessions and your exam score. And every one you attended actually increased your exam score by 2.3 points. So if you attended all three, that's what? 7 points. I mean, that's getting close to 11th grade. Now, obviously, there's some statistical things that we can dive into, but I also found similar, not quite as large impacts on your quiz grades as well. So I can't stress enough, and they start up again this Thursday and Sunday. The CL sessions, people are asking me, how can I study better? How can I think reviewing more problems, which is what they do in those sessions, is really helpful. And the data kind of proves it. Okay? All right. Try to stay warm. We'll see you guys on Thursday.